We're looking at what is real world data. Here we can see that the real world data has various sources like electronic health records, EHR, that stands for electronic health records, medical insurance claims, product disease registries, wearable devices, prescription data that often goes into claims database, and patient reported outcomes. So we'll see what exactly they mean. What is EHR? EHR is electronic health records, and the EHR databases. Well, for example, it's Flatiron database, and EHR data comes from nurses' notes, doctor prescriptions, the vital signs, lab data. So all this information put together forms the EHR data. Usually, the data vendors will have network with multiple hospitals, and they collect the data from these hospitals and collate them to form the EHR databases. This data then can be used for any research or business analytics purposes. Next is claims database. Claims database contains information about the patients. It's usually the insurance data. So whenever a patient has it is covered by the insurance, the hospital data for that particular patient, it's the patient got admitted and underwent a treatment. So what the diagnosis was, what was the treatment the patient had to go through, what kind of surgery it was, procedure codes will be there for surgery for different kind of procedures. For example, radiation is there, surgery is there, and the number of days the patient spent in the hospital, inpatient, and what are the medications prescribed during the stay of the patient. So all this information put together forms the claims databases. It also includes the pharmacy prescriptions and what were the drugs taken by the patient during the course of the treatment in the hospital. So all this information is collected in the claims databases. Then we have registry studies, registry data. Registry data is often collected for post-marketing surveillance. It can be for research purpose also. Post-marketing data. So many companies, they want to see how the drug is doing over the course of time. After it has already been launched in the market, they want to see if there is any adverse events, any other impact, any other effects apart from the one that was initially indicated or approved. So this kind of data is usually what is registry data. On the other hand, it's different from EHR data that is not really collected for research purpose, but it's a usual patient encounters, the patient visits to the hospitals that is naturally observed and collated. Registry studies are often protocol driven. There is a protocol, there's a set of plan, how what kind of study it should be, what was the it has a purpose, it has objective, the outcomes to be measured, etc. On the other hand, when we look at EHR databases, there it's not a prospective study, it's a retrospective data. When we say retrospective data, the data is already collected, not meant for any research studies, but it's actually collected over the course of the patient's visits to the hospitals or admission to the hospital. There it's a retrospective data. In the registry data, the data collection is very standardized based on the protocol. There is less noise in the data. And on the other hand, when we look at EHR data, it has more noise and it's not driven by any protocol. And there will be a lot of missingness compared to other data that is collected as a standardized. Registry studies, the patients are followed over a period of time, a well-defined period of time, and there is a specific interval of time when they are measured. Assessment happens on a particular period of time. On the other hand, when we look at EHR data, there is no specific intervals for assessments. Whenever the patient decides to come to the hospital, they are assessed and evaluations happen, but it's totally dependent on the patient. It's not defined by the researcher or the protocol. Now, next is the wearable devices. So there are smartwatches and other wearable devices that collects information about the patients blood pressure, the patient's body temperature, ECG values, oxygen levels in the body, heart rate, variable heart rate. So all this data is all breath rate. So all this data is collected by the wearable devices. This can be then be analyzed as well to generate some insights about a particular treatment or a disease condition. Then is pharmacy data, prescription data that is already included in the claims database with the insurance coverage. Those who have insurance covered, this particular data is already covered in the claims database. Claims database, for example, it can be Pharmatrix database. And then we have patient reported outcomes. Patient reported outcomes are like quality of life. It's more of subjective also. Like patient decides how is the quality of life, the patient's subjective experience that that is captured in the form of patient reported surveys or outcomes. We can also look at the patient's depression levels, anxiety levels, and overall quality of life and health. So all this kind of data is collected from a patient's perspective, and these are called as PROs or patient reported outcomes. Collect together all this info data, EHR, medical insurance claims, wearable devices registries, and PROs, they all form together as real world data. Then we also have something called real world evidence. The insights that are obtained or that is gained out of this real world data by exploring and examining the real world data, the insights we gain is called as real world evidence. We call it real world because it's not based on any controlled conditions like in clinical trial. So what is the difference between clinical trial and real world data or real world evidence studies? Clinical trial data is collected under controlled conditions. On the other hand, that's not the case for real world data. It's the usual healthcare encounters or patient visits to the hospitals. For example, in real world, in clinical trials, we have informed consent. The patient he has to agree to participate in the study, and it need not be the general population who comes to attend the or participate in the clinical trials. It may not be representative of the general population. At the same time, if we look at once the patient is that gives the consent, next randomization happens. The researcher decides whether the patient should go into the control group or the experimental group. The experimental group is where the intervention is provided, and the control group can be the standard drug in the market or placebo. So again, there is the it is decided by the researcher by randomization. The researcher through it will reduce bias. Obviously, it reduces bias, and there is a blinding also, single blind, double blind, triple blind. So basically, the participants are not aware of what they're receiving. So again, there is certain things that is done by the researcher. On the other hand, these kind of things don't happen in the real world data where a patient goes to the doctor. He's aware of the medicine is given, and there is no inclusion exclusion criteria in collection of the data. On the other hand, there are certain set of factors that are to be taken into consideration, inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria before the subject is or the is a person is or participant is allowed to participate in the clinical trial. That is not the case with real world data collection. Definitely the use of all the controlling the extraneous variables, reducing the noise, does help in improving the ensuring that it's the intervention that is actually producing the effect. We see whatever the effects or outcome we see in the patient, we can be more, there is a more strength in saying that it is because of the intervention. But again, there is generalizability part. If it is in the real world data, it's more in the actual conditions, in the real world data conditions. And there is no control over there. On the other hand, when we start doing research with the real world data, we can definitely apply all these inclusion criteria. We may, for example, if you are working on patients with in the CLC cancer is a type of cancer, then we can select patients with that particular disease condition and omit those who don't have that disease condition, because that's not our area of, because our interested in cancer. So we will not be taking patients with diabetes or hypertension who don't have cancer. So we can apply those criteria, inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria in the process of research when you are using the real world data to generate some insights, real world evidence. In clinical trial has protocol in place. Everything is pre-planned, the number of visits the patient will have. So everything is initially defined before the study started. On the other hand, that is not the case with the collection of real world data. There is nothing planned. It's all dependent upon the patient. Whether the patient comes again to the doctor, the patient may change the network and we may lose that particular patient over the course of time. Or we may have a long range of data because the patient may continue to visit the network hospitals with that which the data vendor has a tie-up, and we are able to get a longitudinal data, often for decades of data. Clinical trials are very usually shorter in period of time, whereas real world evidence, the data is from a long period of time. We can collect where we may get a lot of patients with very long range of time who has been with all the data from since decades. And clinical trial data usually is clean and has less missingness compared to real world data that we have a lot of noise and may require a lot of effort in cleaning the data. Clinical trial data is usually smaller in size compared to real world data, especially if you look at the actual patient encounters with the claims databases, the pharmatrics databases. The data is in billions. It's very huge. And that's one reason we, in real world data analysis, the kind of tools that are used is also different. In SAS, it's pretty common in clinical trials. R is also used in clinical trials. But whereas in real world evidence, we often see that people often work with SQL interface, SQL interface, because the data is so large that it's usually placed in cloud platforms like Snowflake, Redshift, Azure, etc. And this particular data is then pulled and analyzed even in the same environment. And once the data is reduced to a smaller size, then it can be brought to the local environment and can be analyzed with SAS, R, or Python. And all these tools are being used. It is usually any two tools. It may be SQL and R, SQL, SAS, or Python, SQL, Python. So very often we see that two language programming languages are used in real world evidence studies for projects. Next, we'll look at one example of real world evidence project. How, and we'll see a very simple example to to give a start about how what kind of small analysis we can perform on real world data. Thank you very much.